All right. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. We have Jared Trujillo and Blake Dudley joining us today. I'm going to add them to the stream. So it seems that Jared is having some technical difficulties. So they'll be joining us in just a moment. But hello and welcome back. So I'm going to introduce Blake Dudley, and then we'll introduce Jared when he's able to join the stream. So Blake is a queer producer, writer, director, and editor living in New York City. When not working in television post-production, Blake had a thriving career performing as drag queen, the one and only Blake Dudley, and engaging in queer activism and politics in and out of drag, including the Reclaim Pride movement. Blake received his bachelor's degree in film and television production from New York University. And Jared, who will be joining us momentarily, is the president of the Association of Legal Aid Attorneys, an organizer for sex worker liberation, criminal legal system reform, and immigration reform. So how lucky are we? And let's get started. So I'm going to preface our entire dialectic, our entire conversation, with some facts and a quote, and then I'll let you take it away, Blake. Yep. Okay?
Our bios were pretty comparable, I thought. Pretty close backgrounds there.
So here's the reality we are in right now, Blake. We are in the midst of a global pandemic and the fourth industrial revolution. COVID-19 has killed more Americans than died in the Vietnam War. It has killed more New Yorkers than died on 9/11. The CDC projects a 9/11 death toll every single day, starting June 1st. More than 30 million Americans are unemployed, and the Fed has projected unemployment numbers worse than the Great Depression. Congress is still in recess. Those are the facts. That is the reality we're living in today. And now here's a quote, and I'll let you take it away, Blake. RuPaul. We're all born naked, and everything else is drag.
Everything else is money from fracking oil. Well, those are, yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I want RuPaul's advice right now.
Why is that?
Well, I need to think about what I'm going to say based on whether I'm planning on auditioning in the future or not. No, I think also we should say the New York State Legislature isn't meeting right now as well, in addition to our federal.
Well, the New York State Legislature, Blake, is meeting via Zoom because it turns out that the city can actually still function somewhat, but our federal legislatures are shut down. They're in recess. So anyway, continue.
Yeah. The thing about drag queens, as we're realizing, with the 10,000 Instagram live notifications that pop up every day for all of us, is that we'll do what we have to do regardless of the circumstances. For a lot of us, doing this from home is not ideal. I'm kind of in a unique position because I had a full-time day job. I do drag on the side. It's not my main source of income. Hello.
Hello, we have Sideways Jared. How do we flip you, Jared?
Technical difficulties.
No worries. Welcome. We'll have to tilt our heads to get our Jared in.
This is also good because the hair hides the non-AirPod.
Now Jared's upside down.
Oh. This is going great.
I love it. I love it. Nice. Killing it.
Better?
Yeah.
Okay.
Terrific. Go ahead, Blake, and then I'll introduce
so people
Jared more formally. Go ahead.
People adapt if you're lucky enough to be in a position where you can. So I had a job in TV production. I don't anymore because nothing is filming. So I'm on unemployment. Drag has always been a side gig, extra money on the side. I do it because I love it, not to pay my rent. But there are a lot of queens and trans performers of color who are not as lucky as me, who need the income from live shows to survive, and that's not happening right now. And also, like, you know, the emotional fulfillment you get from performing for a live audience, which is also just not happening via the internet, as fun as all these videos are. So it's like, you know, everyone is having their own financial and economic impact from all of this. But for drag performers who are already sometimes the most marginalized people in our LGBTQ community, it's a combination of an emotional and a financial impact.
Yeah, and I had the great joy of listening in and enjoying your recent performance with a whole awesome lineup of stars. And if you haven't checked out Blake's incredible CNN performance, check it out on the Twitter, which your handle is Blake_Pruitt. Is that right?
It's just Blake Pruitt. No underscore.
Blake Pruitt. Okay, yeah. Check it out. It is some good content right there. But I'm going to formally introduce Jared, and then we'll dive right back in, if that is all right. So we have Jared Trujillo joining us, who is the president of the Association of Legal Aid Attorneys. Jared is an organizer who advocates for sex worker liberation, criminal legal system reform, justice for workers. Jared lobbies at the local, state, and federal levels, drafts legislation, and represents more than 1,600 legal service workers at 12 New York nonprofits through the Association of Legal Aid. He's also a board member of the New York State Defenders Association and a steering committee member of Decrim New York, a coalition of groups working to decriminalize sex work and empower sex workers, and is speaking in his personal capacity. So welcome, Jared, right side up.
I also do all those things. I just forgot to put it in the bio.
Yeah. Amazing. So let us start off. I want to start off with Jared. I was reading an article recently in the Times about you and your work, and it cited the fact that as many as a third of legal aid lawyers in New York have to work or choose to work additional jobs. And there was a story about one legal aid attorney who says that she'll stay at the office until 7, do a few hours of work for Grubhub or Uber Eats, waiting until most parking meter restrictions have lifted, and then sometimes works a midnight to 4 a.m. shift to take advantage of the Uber pay in the early morning hours. These are our legal aid attorneys in the great city of New York. So,
yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Could you share with us the state of the work you're doing, and particularly in today's context? We set up the Dialectic just framing the stark data around COVID and COVID in New York.
Yeah, I mean, for a long time, as long as there's been institutional providers to provide, public defense and immigration work and housing work, we've always just really been underpaid. Our salaries start at about $10,000 less than attorneys that work for the city, and over 10 years that grows to about an $18,000 delta. And on top of not having pensions and a lot of the other things that city attorneys have, but having the same law school debt because we go to the same law schools and we really do the same work just on different sides of the courtroom, representing low-income folks on our side. It's just really unfortunate. Recently, the city, without going into too much detail about this, recently the city did take steps to close that pay disparity. But there's still a long way to go, and it really just leaves so many of my members leaving public defense, leaving immigration law before the 10-year anniversary, not because they don't love the work, because we do, but because it just becomes economically unfeasible to pay, just skyrocketing law school debt and living in one of the most expensive cities in the world, without really making an equitable wage. And for as bad as it is for my members that are attorneys, it's even worse for my members that are social workers and paralegals and everything else. About 74% of those folks are rent burdened, meaning that they're paying more than a third of their income just to have a place to live in New York City, so they can do, just the really grueling, emotionally difficult labor of representing low-income folks in New York. So that's not to say that it's all bad. I love being a public defender and a juvenile defender more than anything in the world. But I would like it more if, I maybe didn't have to work as a bartender on the side for most of the, and most of my members being in the same boat.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. And I'll say, just coming up in the comments, there's a lot of love for the both of you.
Wait, where do we see the comments? Oh,
they're
I see.
on the right hand side. So there's some love coming in, some love and appreciation. But I was so excited for this dialectic in particular, because I think we are bridging many somewhat silos of LGBT activism. And I think this is a great opportunity to not only introduce new people to our different areas of work and activism, but really try to find some of the common bridges and problem solve beyond that. So to begin, there was this fantastic viral content with Now This News that Jared was on. And I wonder if, Jared, for those who are totally new to your line of activism and work around sex work, could you introduce us again? Because many people here, many people who will be watching, have been in the Yang Gang or in the universal basic income movement and the kind of fight to end poverty. But can you share with us fundamentally what it is you do and why it matters?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, people have been, and by me, I mean, there are just so many Black and brown trans women in particular that really do this work, that have been doing this work, since even before Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. But since since about 1975, people have been really active on sex worker liberation. In 2018, both houses of Congress and President Trump signed SESTA and FOSTA, the Stop Enabling Sex Trafficking Act and the Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act, bills that were aimed allegedly at preventing the online trafficking of marginalized folks, including minors. But in reality, it just made doing sex work incredibly difficult and even more dangerous than it already is. So as a result, before that, Backpage was shut down, which is what a lot of sex workers used in order to advertise. So that meant that they could screen clients, and it just made the work a lot safer. And so sex workers knew that SESTA and FOSTA were really problematic. Sex workers told, they told the representatives that these laws were really problematic, and yet they passed anyway. And all of our faves voted for them. I think 97 members in the Senate voted for it, and I think all but 3 members in the House voted for it. Barbara Lee, and then the other 2 are escaping me at the moment. So that, SESTA and FOSTA really reinvigorated a lot of sex workers to fight for really their right to survive, particularly street-based Black and brown sex workers. So last year in New York, we worked with Senator Ramos, Assemblyman Godfrey, to get a bill, the Stop Violence and Sex Trades Act, introduced, which would decriminalize consensual sex between adults. The reason why, consensual sex between adults. We did this because it actually makes people safer by decriminalizing sex work. You bring it out of the shadows. You reduce instances where people could be subjected to police violence, and ultimately, it enables you to put in other protections and really recognize the fact that sex workers are people, sex workers are humans, sex workers have every right to survive and be able to support themselves as everyone else, and we don't need this criminal framework that ultimately just subjects people to all sorts of violence and limits their recourse. I am a former sex worker. In law school, I traded sex, and also as a teenager, I traded sex as a survivor. So it's it's kind of it's coming home for me in many ways, and it's just really cool to see some of the activists really making a huge difference in New York politics.
There is so much I want to dive into and unpack, and again, work together to problem solve here. But I want to bring in Blake as well, because to me, one of the I think there's some audio issues coming from to me, one connective tissue here that I think Jared alluded to does relate to this idea of everything being some form of drag or performance. And this is especially true in the context of the law, of politics, and of the law and politics. I'm not sure where this might be coming from Jared's side. We can we'll mute let's see. There's some garbles. Especially in the context of law and politics, Blake, everything is some sort of performance. But when you have a suit on, let's say, or when you're wearing a tie, or your hair is done a certain way, those words and actions carry a different level of weight and credence. And so, so what are your thoughts on that in the kind of meta level of drag involved in all of law and politics and activism generally?
Well, it's, I guess, a few things. I mean, we see it with AOC, with the New York Times articles talking about the way she dresses and where she goes shopping and the way she talks and all of that in terms of presentation, not necessarily matching what we think of for an elected official, which is insane that we've gotten to a point where we don't think of elected officials as just people in our community who we choose to represent us and who have an open dialogue with us and who we can also like hang out with and talk to. That's insane to me. In terms of drag and activism, I mean, they've always gone together. It was an illegal act to just walk down the street in drag for a very long time. So that obviously carries something with it. I get a little, I question a little bit now when I hear that, just leaving the house in drag is a political act, because I don't know if that's true anymore, actually. It's just in the past 5 to 8 to 10 years, it's just turned into something totally different. And I don't know if me just walking down the street dressed in drag is a political act. I still might get weird comments, and but I don't think that makes it a form of resistance inherently just by getting in drag and walking down the street. That's something I always think about. Whereas, 20, 30, 40 years ago, leaving the house and being seen publicly in drag was a definitive political statement.
Yes, and I actually want to read a quote of yours that I found really resonant. And I certainly want to get to that evolution, that juncture point, just over the past decade and 5 years, in what the Times called the golden age of drag, and also revisit and dive deeper into Jared's work. But I'll just read a quick quote from you that I think is really
You dug this one up. I saw that.
So you said, quote, "Everyone has to find what it is for themselves that lets them be the most comfortable with who they are. And for me, I guess it's putting on makeup and a wig and dressing like a woman. So a friend of mine walked into the bar. I saw him walk in. I was standing with a few other people. I saw him look at me and I waved at him and he just kept looking at me. Like, who the fuck is this person? And I realized he didn't realize it was me in drag. And that was a feeling I had never experienced before. But in that moment, I realized I could be someone totally different and meet people on totally new terms. They have no idea who I am outside of that or what my life has been for the years before that. None of that is there. I can just meet people as Blake Dudley in a totally new way and almost start over with how I interact with people and how I approach people. And I think these words carry more resonance even beyond just drag and just your experience. That's what I think makes them so powerful in many ways, because I think everyone, no matter what walk of life they are, has had the experience of some form of code switching or transformation or entering or moving to a new job or a new city or a change in family or environment or home. Could you, kind of speak to that idea of being someone else while being yourself?
Right. I mean, it's always, I feel like we hear 1,000 times a day now, like, doing drag just reveals who I really am on the inside. So that's not exactly like a crazy thought anymore to people. But it's so funny how I think that video you stole that from was like from 4 years, like when I started doing drag.
Yeah.
So it's weird to hear that. I wouldn't say I wouldn't call it dressing up like a woman now, because that just sounds silly to me. So that's not what it is. But, and the other thing is, like, I almost experience now the opposite, where I will be out. A few months ago, I would be out and run into someone who knows me in drag, but not outside of drag. And it's like, I can never remember
who knows which person.
I can never remember who knows which. Right. Or if someone follows you on Instagram, I don't know if they've seen photos of me outside, like not in drag. It's always like a weird, I know who you are, but I can't remember if we've met one way or the other or both ways. But that's all. That's kind of very like surface level, whatever. But it's fun. You feel like a secret agent, kind of. But on a deeper level, it does let out this side of you. I mean, my personality when I'm in drag is still me, but when I'm lip sync, when I'm in the middle of doing a number, that energy that I have is not something that comes out in daily life. I wouldn't say that I am playing a character when I'm in drag. I'm not like a, there's Coco Peru or Varla G. Merman, or there's a certain style where like that drag persona is a character. I think that's less common. I don't want to generalize, but I feel like it's less common with queens coming up now to fully put on a character and a persona. It's more so like, this is me. It's heightened a little bit. I'm dressing in drag, revealing my real self, blah, blah, blah. But like, it does bring out something inside of you that I don't have at my day job. I don't interact with people that way when I'm at work. But yeah, that idea of code switching or moving to a new city or whatever it is. And queer people realize that early on. That's something that RuPaul says a lot that I am into. It's like, we realize very early that it's all a joke and it's all just dressing up.
So I want to just bring in Jared and dive deeper into this. There's just some audio things. So I'm going to mute and unmute both of you. But what you just said, I think is so important and is why this dialectic is so important and goes far beyond our own immediate experiences and realms of activism. Because what you just said is, we realize very early that it's all a show, it's all kind of a joke, or it's all some kind of facade. Now, the reason this is so important and so central is that on a national political level, over the last number of years, we're only now collectively beginning to realize this on such an enormous scale. And so you have, for instance, in the second Democratic debate this cycle, someone like Andrew Yang in his closing statement say, "We're all up here in our makeup and our and our suits, and we're all putting on this show with our rehearsed sound bites and zingers. And this is why we have a reality TV president, because we have a reality TV show process for determining who should run the country and thereby the world. And there's so many other layers of this, not just the process and the role of our sense-making organs, i.e. the media, but so much of the themes and the ideas behind this campaign and movement is that our entire sets of institutions and stories we've been telling about them, like, for instance, the university system, or like our healthcare system, or like our criminal justice system, are tragically crumbling under stories about them that were maybe made some sense, a semblance of sense 4 or 5 decades ago. But the people steering the ship, the people writing our policy and determining our laws, are still stuck in that time machine. There was this really stark data point, and I'll bring Jared in now, cited in the recent New Yorker article, and it said from a former CDC director that 50 to 80% of deaths from COVID in New York City could have been categorically avoided if we had shut down the city just 10 days sooner. And this is just the really stark human cost in reality of what policy and policymakers can do in the context of this show, of this great farce. So I'm going to unmute Jared and invite you to comment on this, but also more specifically, there's some garbling. Sorry, sorry for everyone.
I'm going to change rooms. Hopefully that helps.
Is again taking that video of yours, for example. Let me mute you for a moment while I set this up. Is as you said, LGBTQ youth are 7 times more likely to engage in, quote, survival sex in New York City. And I want to parse out a little bit the idea of sex work for survival as opposed to this other strand you mentioned of liberation. And I think, Blake, you also alluded to this in this fork, right? Is it a matter of survival, of doing what you can to pay the bills? Or is it a matter of liberation, or both? And the other thing I want to toss in there to set this up for you, Jared, is the thing I'm obsessed with and fighting for, as you know, is this universal basic income, this unconditional cash floor during the crisis of $2,000 a month for every American, and thereafter in perpetuity, $1,000 a month for every American. Because in part of these arguments from coercion, right? The idea that someone has to do anything just to survive. And that thing, most poignantly perhaps, being something like sex work. How do you think about that? Again, parsing out the arguments from coercion versus liberation, and your thoughts on a universal basic income as this potential source of liberation.
Yeah, and so what I'll say is, I mean, when we think about sex work, there's, I guess, 3 definitions that are really important. There are people that are sex workers that, that are doing it by choice because that's what they want to do. And, if they could have any job in the world, being a sex worker is what they want to do. I don't think that that's a huge group of people, but it's certainly, greater than 0. Then you have people that do sex work, because of circumstance, which is what you're talking about. So it's people that, frankly, I've done a lot of jobs by circumstance. I worked at Subway by circumstance. I was a janitor for a while by circumstance. And it's people that, they're not coerced into doing that form of work, but, that's just what's available to them. And so for sex workers, you see that with like a lot of trans Latino women that might not have access to other legal forms of employment, that might just, be excluded from other from other segments of the economy. A lot of Black and brown trans women, a lot of trans and gender nonconforming folks in general. And certainly myself as a teenager as a sex worker. And then finally you have people that are doing it solely for, what's called traditional coercion. So people that are actually trafficking victims. So people that don't want to be involved in the sex industry at all, but because, most trafficking victims are people that are formerly homeless. So they're people that, got wrapped up into the system, however. But, just staying on task, as far as people that, really do it from circumstance, I do feel if there were some mechanism for people to know that, that they will be cared for, that they could do, that they could really pursue their passions, and that they would still have, enough money to really just survive. I think that'd be really interesting as far as, what the sex industry looks like. One of the issues with the sex industry, particularly now when we're operating under this paradigm of criminalization, is that sometimes people have to take more difficult clients, particularly with the passing of Cest and FOSTA. Oftentimes, sex work is just more difficult than it necessarily needs to be. And I think if people had, some type of, if there was some floor that people couldn't fall under, whether you call that universal basic income or something else, then people could, more freely go into sex work or leave sex work if that's what they wanted to do.
Absolutely. And so I guess if you can, again, just thinking of someone, I'm just going to mute you a lot, just thinking of someone who, sorry about that, who, like, trying to introduce even this idea in the first place. So first is, what percentage would you say of people who are in sex work, you say, would be in it for those varying reasons? And then the second is, can you walk us through maybe, either in your story or a personal story, of that kind of trajectory, that like path through what leads someone, like if someone is on the outside and they're going to say, rah, rah, Jared, right? Like, I am kind of morally opposed, let's say, to the entire idea, the entire concept of the commodification of sex, or trading sex, or prostitution, or sex work. Like, how would you respond to what I imagine are, and you hear from many, some kind of moral or innate kind of opposition to the idea itself?
And I hear that. And first off, sorry that I'm like running around my apartment. I'm just trying to find a place that doesn't have static. So
I like the apartment tour.
But anyway, as far as, and a lot of people bring up the moral argument for sex work. And not to be crass, but frankly, their morality it doesn't matter. No matter what someone thinks of sex work, one way or the other, it's called the oldest profession in the world for a reason, because it's been around forever. And, people can think that sex workers are subhuman, and our criminal legal system certainly does, because they do sex work, because of who they are. People just treat them so harshly, but it doesn't matter what you think of someone. Sex work is always going to exist, for several reasons, because people just need to survive, or because that's what people want to do. So what I say to people that make a moralistic argument is, we're not debating on whether we want sex work to exist or not, because it's going to. It's, do you want people that trade sex, whether it's for survival or for choice, do you want them to be as safe as possible? Do you want to, you can't eliminate all harm within the sex trade, but you can certainly do a lot to reduce it. And reducing harm, according to Amnesty International and so many different organizations, reducing harms really starts with decriminalizing sex work, destigmatizing sex work, bringing it out of the shadows, treating the people that trade sex as actual humans, and then starting from there, and then making sure that people have access to what they need. UBI is a great idea. Just making sure that people have access to housing is a great place to start. But ultimately, it's, your morality, it doesn't matter.
So it's so interesting, because I wonder how you see, both of you in your own respective fields of activism, the kind of arc of the transformation of the movement, especially as it relates to many of the arguments around morality. Because if you track, I mean, each of these areas, everything was criminalized, right? Homosexuality itself was recently criminalized. 27 states still don't have protections for firing on the basis of gender orientation or sexual orientation. And we've seen an
Conversion
interesting
therapy is still legal.
The arc of the kind of moral history around LGBTQ equality has traced an interesting history. Again, we're here in the 10th district, which covers Stonewall, right? The home of the Stonewall riots of now 51 years ago to the date in almost a month. And I'm curious how you see, because I think the arguments from people who led the marriage equality fight was, well, it was a matter of exposure. It was a matter of people coming out. It was a matter of, people being comfortable enough with people who weren't like them. But so, how do the both of you see this evolution recently? And maybe that narrative itself is flawed.
Well, the thing underlying that is that they are actually it's like, oh, everyone just has a cousin or a friend or a friend of a friend who you didn't realize is different in this way, but they're actually not that different from you. It's like, not everyone actually knows a queer trans sex worker. Like, not everyone actually knows a drag queen. Not so like everyone is just a couple doors down. Like, your friend from church's son could be gay, but like he's normal, is kind of a little dated and just had some like underlying assumptions of like, oh, this like normal seeming person just has this one little thing that's different about them, so you should treat them like a person. The continuation of that being like, oh, but these crazy people, like, maybe you don't have to treat them like people because they're very different, or you don't know them.
Jared?
Yeah, I agree with Blake like 3,000%. And I would just add, when you talk about the evolution of the movement, it comes down to, for who are you talking about? In the 10th district, are things better for Black trans women than they were in 1969? Yes, but not by as many degrees as they are for, say, cis gay men. I can think of I can think of 6 lawyers in New York that are former sex workers, just that I know of. And the only ones that can be out about it are men. I think that, will my career suffer from being out as a former sex worker? I mean, like, I would only work at like pretty liberal places anyway, so maybe not. But like almost all the femmes that I know that are former sex workers could never be out about it, just because of the stigma behind it, and because of the idea that, like, women don't really have as much agency over their sexuality as we really allow men to have. Again, just thinking of Black trans women and brown trans women, I mean, so many of the people that I organize with that are within the movement, they still can't find jobs because what they did was so stigmatized. In New York, for queer and for gay and lesbians, we passed anti-discrimination laws 17 years ago. Trans folks weren't added to it until this year. I think that the conversation has changed. You think about someone like Sylvia Rivera, Marsha P. Johnson, and people like call them heroes now. But like in the same speech that, Corey Johnson was calling them a hero, And in the same speech that the mayor was referring to them as heroes, well, you're still criminalizing the way that they supported themselves, which is by doing sex work. Like, they're not just heroes for throwing the first bricks at Stonewall. They're also heroes because they housed, homeless, sex working teenagers that had nowhere else to go. And we're still criminalizing that. And without being too esoteric about, what the actual prostitution statutes are, we still like just really criminalize kindness in and of itself. Again, one of the most heroic things that Sylvia and Marcia did was they housed teenagers that had nowhere else to go. Well, under Penal Law 230-25, they'd be felons for just showing that simple act of kindness. And so, has the movement progressed? Of course it has. Things are so much better for so many people. But for the 23 Black trans women that were, murdered last year for simply having the audacity to exist in public spaces, things aren't better. There's a sex worker that was one of my heroes that we organized with. Her name is T.S. Candy, and she'd be fine with me sharing her story. She's been up in Albany with us talking about why we need to repeal this law called the Walking While Trans ban. It's Penal Law 240-37. Basically, it allows officers to arrest people because they think they look like a prostitute, even if they're not doing anything illegal. So in one instance, an officer admitted under oath that he went up to women that had Adam's apples, basically saying that he targeted trans people. So she's up in Albany talking about why this bill is so inequitable. And then on her way back from Albany, she can't even get off of the subway without being pulled over for this exact same statute that is constitutionally dubious at best. So, I think that things are better, but I think to the extent that things are better, it depends on who you're talking about.
And I want to clarify in terms of earlier when I was saying just going out of the house in drag isn't a political act anymore. I don't mean that it's not it can't be dangerous or that it holds no meaning or value or that our community isn't marginalized anymore. It does mean a different thing for me because when it comes down to it, I'm still a cis white man. And people look at me walking down the street in drag in a different way than they look at a trans woman of color walking down the street. But I was kind of that, just leaving the house in drag as a political act, not being necessarily true anymore, was more coming from a place of having drag queens now who are so completely unengaged politically, which is kind of interesting to me. So I kind of don't buy it when I hear just dressing in drag is a political act of subversion, because I know a lot of drag queens who couldn't write that in a sentence.
I think there is so much subversion, I think, in all of this, and there's so many layers and levels that are just not just inherently fascinating, but really, again, to what you were saying, Jared, come down to life and death many times. And I want to just point back to a point you said, which is something I've been saying that I know all too well, is that the idea that it gets better is hollow without any promise of financial security or haven in the case or condition that your family, your community, your city, your state, your government not just rejects you for who you are, but even criminalizes you and your existence. And the reality is LGBTQ people of all kinds are overrepresented among the homeless, the foster children, the poor, the food insecure, being kicked out by parents at a higher rate. 1 in 5 LGBTQ people across the country lives in poverty. 1 in 3 trans people of color lives in poverty. And to go back to your point about the almost sanitization of some of our civil rights heroes that we venerate now, Martin Luther King, in the year before he was assassinated, in Chaos Your Community, was making the case, the civil rights case, for a guaranteed minimum income, saying that we can eradicate poverty once and for all races, for all classes. That poverty was an absence of cash, not character. That basic income would make every problem easier to solve, not necessarily solve every problem. But to me, so much of what ties together all of our areas of work is really the reality of what is downstream of poverty, and the added layer of the criminal justice system and our statutes criminalizing poverty and homelessness, and all the downstream effects of that. Either of you feel free to. I mean, this to me is kind of this kind of theory of everything. This kind of unitary thesis that drives me in this particular fight, which is, if we can get the boot off of people's throats, if we can bring everyone together to have some stake in it, regardless of their moral opposition to our existence or what we do or how we live or who we are, everyone has a stake. And in this moment right now, you know, I had to gather together the list because there have been so many interesting voices coming out of the woodworks that you might never imagine. The strangest of bedfellows, from, you know, of course, Martin Luther King to Barack Obama, Nancy Pelosi, the Pope, Anthony Scaramucci, AOC, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, Justin Amash, Mitt Romney, Greg Mankiw, Adam Schiff, Tim Ryan. I mean, this is the kind of coalition that comes together, or can potentially, in a time like this of crisis, where, as we started off, more Americans have died from COVID than died in the Vietnam War. More New Yorkers have died from COVID than died in 9/11. And the CDC just said that we will have a 9/11 death toll every single day, starting June 1st. So on the one hand, there's no time like a crisis for power to try to seize more power and cancel elections, for example. But there's also no time like crisis for real structural change, and real structural change that might not have otherwise been possible because not everyone had a stake in our communities and our faiths. Thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with you completely, particularly around your point of, you know, there being, I mean, this is, you know, obviously a terrible time because so many people, but a lot of people were suffering before. And a lot of people, because they were suffering, really were mobilized and really, you know, have been building community and been building a political infrastructure, been building allies, and have been telling their stories. And so I'm hoping that, you know, with so much of humanity really just struggling, that, you know, in this, I guess, collective effort to really bring up everyone, that everyone truly is, you know, remembered, whether it's, you know, a drag queen or if it's, you know, a trans kid in foster care that's just trying to survive.
But I think the one thing I'll say critically to that, Jared, is there is no inevitability. There's no natural order to history. There's no teleology. There's no inevitable determination of what will happen in a time of crisis. And you just have to look back at the last Great Depression, which literally led to the Holocaust and the Second World War, you know, nearly a century ago. And we're talking about projections now in the coming weeks and months for a worse Great Depression. So there is nothing inevitable about moments like these. And in our district, in this 10th district, it is this microcosm. It's this ground zero for all of these forces, all of the inequities and the polarity of our economy. The biggest winners and the biggest losers, many times living on the opposite side of the same street. From crumbling public housing to luxury developments that sit vacant as investment vehicles. It just couldn't paint a clearer picture of the type of economy and society that we've inherited. I want to bring Blake in on mute.
Yeah, I mean, I am in a housing lottery apartment that is rent stabilized. So I'm lucky enough that my unemployment can cover my rent. But that's like a very, very special situation. And it's being inside of the system is like, it's just like it's barely a Band-Aid, like giving affordable units in luxury buildings to dozens of people who meet certain income brackets. It's like, and you know, it's the amount that the rent stabilized and rent controlled apartments in this city have just gone away over the last few decades is not an accident, but it's happened, and we're now at the point where it's almost impossible for a normal person to live here, and yet we have high rises that are empty and owned by people who don't live here. So it's like, and our solution is keep building luxury high rises, like give a couple of the units to people who oftentimes still make a fair amount of money, but just not as much as the people who pay full price. I mean, some of these housing lottery apartments are way above my income bracket. It's like people who are making 90, 100K a year can be applying for some of these units. So it's like, it feels like we're living in a patchwork of solutions.
So this is such an interesting, poignant point. And we had Michael Sandel on last week. He's a moral philosopher. And one of the things he called out and suggested, like you just really pointed to, Blake, is our American system of meritocracy, of merit, right? The idea where winners deserve their winnings because they've worked for it, and losers deserve to have lost because they didn't work for it. I think this really, again, there's so many layers and levels of subversion, because all three of us, in the American context, represent the winners. We are, this is the most highly educated district, one of the most highly educated in the country. We all have some sort of advanced degree, which puts us on its own in the top third of the American population. If you think about the median, the average American, they're a high school educated worker working as a cashier, working in retail, working in truck driving or transportation, working at a call center. And the winners in this system feel like losers. So, Jared, I mean, having even gone to law school, being a lawyer yourself, I have many thoughts about the legal education system and our the practice of law. But I'm really curious to hear your thoughts, as this especially relates to the law and the rules that guide the basic freedoms of our people.
Often. It's something that I really do struggle with quite often. And just thinking, so before I was a public defender, I worked with kids in the foster care system, and I was a juvenile defense attorney. And my reason for doing that kind of work is I was just thinking, I'm someone who grew up without a lot of money. I'm someone who has experienced homelessness at different levels. And so if I can enter the system, then I can, bring in all this insight from being someone who's formerly homeless, from being someone who's formerly poor, and from being someone who's formerly a sex worker. And, I'm going to, be everyone's savior and just like do all the work. But then the reality is that, as I said in my rent stabilized apartment in Chelsea, like I'm a lot of degrees from my clients. And I think that's just what's so fundamentally broken by the system is that, or broken about the system, is that, you know, you can, no matter who you are, you can have the best of intentions, but the reality is that so much of the power in this country is really, you know, concentrated in the hands of people that aren't, you know, even if they have experienced homelessness or if they have experienced, poverty, they're probably not experiencing it at the time that, you know, they're actually making decisions, which I think just makes the system just so inherently flawed. That said, you know, I am really optimistic about what the system could look like and ought to look like, and how I think that people can, you know, can make it look moving forward. You know, most of my work is up in Albany, and when we're up in Albany, and by we I mean a lot of the criminal justice advocates and a lot of the housing advocates, I do think that there is a real intentional desire to include directly impacted folks within advocacy efforts, not to just, you know, not to just fetishize them and to have them be, you know, just speak, but to really be part of the decision-making process about what strategies look like and what policies we pursue. So I think, you know, Jonathan, as you noted before, the system's been broken for a very long time and nothing is inevitable. You know, people say that, you know, the wealthy arc of justice, you know, are being charged justice, but like, I don't know that that's actually ever played out. But I do see so much mobilization, and so many people that are really dedicated to actually fixing, or to actually maybe not fixing the system, but making it a little bit better or making it a little bit more equitable. So I'm hopeful, but at the same time, you know, I can, to answer your question, I definitely recognize a lot of the inequities and how systematic they are, and how they're systematic simply because the people that have power that are making the decisions aren't the people that, you know, are going to be the most impacted by, you know, whatever negative externality there is.
Right, and
Yeah.
it's like we're in a broken system, I guess, but it's that way for a reason. Like, it's that way because a lot of people want it to be that way. So it's not necessarily broken. It's doing what it's supposed to be doing for some people.
I think this is such an important point, Blake. Oh, kind of unmute, Jared. Sorry.
Now, disagreeing with Blake, it's something that, you know, like within the criminal legal system, people always talk about it being broken. It's like, no, the criminal legal system is, you know, it's we got it from slavery, and it's, you know, it's moved from slavery by a couple of degrees, but not all that many. And so it's, you know, like you say, it's not broken. It's operating. It's messed up, but it's not broken. It's operating exactly how it's messed up.
But again, like, you know, speaking about being optimistic, we are, if you can be optimistic right now, we're in a place where it's a lot easier for a lot of people to imagine a completely different system than it was 3 months ago. And there are a lot of people who've been working really hard since before I was born to imagine a new system and are continuing to do that. But there are also a lot of people who never even considered it, who now are open to an entirely new world. I mean, we're all open to a world of possibilities right now, and a lot of them are not good, but some of them could be better.
Yeah, I think two points I want to draw out from that exchange is, one is the idea and the power of how sometimes exceptions are used and even exploited to prove the rule and to sustain the structures and systems in place, right? So you have the handful of cases where, let's say, someone goes from homeless to Harvard, let's say, as you know, as an example, and then that's then used as justification for well, look, there's actually social mobility. But this is why looking at the data and being rooted in this objective empirical reality is so important, because then you look at the United States relative to the world, and it turns out we're not doing too great when it comes to the reality of social mobility, and people actually tend to be mostly trapped within the conditions and the class within which they're born. And then the other, as Poe just commented, is the idea that these systems respond to a set of incentives, and they're actually working as designed. And so if we even zoom out one step further, our entire system revolves around the returns to capital, right? So if you're running a business, or if you really have any role in the economy, the entire market is designed to return the greatest returns most efficiently to capital, to cash, to money, and not to people. And over the last number of years, this is before COVID, before Trump, we saw this historic divergence, this historic split. One between the split between GDP, or just the measure of the size of our economy, right? How much, and life expectancy, where the average life expectancy in the United States had declined for 3 years in a row, on average. This is before Trump and before COVID, because suicides and drug overdoses had overtaken car accident deaths as leading causes of death. And then the other is this great split, this great divergence between returns to capital and returns to labor. And all this means is, how much money does money get you versus human labor and the work that people do. So again, it's like all of these ideas and trends and realities are unique and grounded in each of our own experiences in their own way. But this magnifies out on a much larger scale. And we're talking on a national level in terms of the incentives for the entire system itself.
And it is like we are somewhat hearing in a mainstream, repeated way the questioning of the idea that, like, oh, just because you're the boss and you employ all these people and make all this money, that doesn't necessarily mean you earn it. This came up in the presidential debates. Like, did you earn that money? Do you deserve to be a billionaire? Like, that is something that is in the conversation now in a certain way that hasn't always been spoken about in a public mainstream way, because that's something that people don't want to be questioned. It's like, oh, like maybe you're not actually doing the actual amount of work that would cause someone to earn $5 billion a year, if that is possible. Like, what is that actually, like, what do you actually have to do to earn? Like, what does the word earn mean? Like, what do you actually have to do to earn that?
And this is
just because you're smart enough to be where you are, does that mean you earn something? Like, it's, but yeah.
And this is part of the reality of this age of software, of new technology and artificial intelligence, where all of these gains are converging and converging and converging into not just a handful of firms, the Amazons, Facebooks, Googles, Ubers of the world, but a handful of individuals who control those firms. But I want to complicate this a little bit with a quote from you, Jared, which is, you said queerness is something you're told to be ashamed of. But in the context of sex work, sometimes you can take that agency and actually profit from your sexuality. And so there's this interesting subversion. This is on the kind of liberation side of sex work. But can you unpack that a little bit for us? Because does this actually complicate the idea of inherent human worth, or the worth that we derive from our work and being able to exchange our work for a profit?
So it totally does, to answer your question. But so what I meant by that is, queer and trans youth, particularly runaway and homeless youth, are about 7 to 8 times more likely to trade sex than heterosexual kids and than cisgender kids. and that's for a variety of different reasons. I mean, but mainly it all comes down to a lot of them are kicked out of their homes first, and they're oftentimes kicked out of their homes because they're queer, because they're trans, and they're told that that queerness or that transness is something that they should be ashamed of. It's something that makes them other. It's something that makes them unworthy of love, whether it's from their parents or from their peers or from a brother or sister or from whoever. And to say that like the profit gives the fact that people can profit from it gives them agency is, I mean, if you are a homeless youth that's trading sex, you need to find a way to pay rent and to put on clothes, to put clothes on your back and everything else. And the fact that you could, utilize your queerness or your transness, things that society has always told you are things that you should be ashamed of and things that make you unworthy of love. For a lot of people, that's really empowering and liberating. But to answer your question, it's liberating in the sense that the only way for you to survive or for you to actually, get, just a scintilla of what enables you to be considered human. You kind of have to exploit something that, for lack of a better word, that that you were told is so shameful. So in a way, it's, I don't know, when I said that, when I was speaking and now this, I heard it come out of my mouth and I'm like, oh my God, that is so peak capitalist. I feel disgusting for saying it, but it's true. But it's, it is.
You're really good at finding quotes from us.
That was not my intention.
but it was in so many ways. But at the same time, it is completely true because that's just the system that we have. The system that we live in says that, if you have this many units and the units being dollars, you can get, this pair of jeans. And if you can get this pair of jeans, then you are that much more of a valuable person. So it's, I don't regret my time as a sex worker. I've had a lot of different jobs, and, being a sex worker is like somewhere in the middle of them as far as like what's the best and what's the worst.
What's the best and what's the worst?
It depends on the day. Like right now, being a public defender is not a lot of fun, but other days I love it. So it depends on the day. The worst is probably working at Subway. I was actually fired from there. But
in Manhattan, in District 10.
Not in District 10. This was way back in the Midwest.
Are you from? Oh, so you're not from New York originally?
No, I'm not from New York, but I've lived here for 8 years now. But yeah, it's just unfortunate that we live in a society where your ability to buy things is inherently tied to your worth as a human being, and that's, I don't know, that's just kind of, it's unfortunate that that's like what I found empowering about sex work. The first time that I did it is that, hey, I'm taking my queerness and using it to be able to buy things and to accumulate all these units of self-worth. But at the same time, it's it is a practical reality for how a lot of particularly teenagers feel that do choose to sell sex.
I mean, if it makes you feel better, I love hearing that idea just now. And I hadn't really thought about drag in those terms, but it's the same thing. It's taking what people made fun of you for in school and using it to not just make money, but create art and have a sense of community and perform and capture a whole room with something that people would tease you for wanting to do when you were 10 years old. It's like everyone just wants to put on their mom's heels and like dance around and lip sync to Britney Spears. And it's like, oh, that's my job now. So it's just, it's kind of the same thing in a weird way. And it is unfortunate that we think about framing it in terms of money first. It's like, oh, I can make money off of this, but we are able to reclaim that in other ways and get joy from it, hopefully.
So I'd actually love, if the both of you are open to it, and I happily partake, but just sharing a little bit about your own kind of personal journey and arc in that context, right? Going from this is stigmatized and wrong and a source of shame and judgment, to some way, like along that course, oh, I can monetize this, or I can actually create joy or art or value or meaning or community from it, because that's a long journey, a long way that may be ongoing. But if you could share a little bit about what that looked like for you.
Oh, and by that, do you mean sex work? Do you mean queerness? Do you mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like, frankly, all of the above, and whatever to you kind of felt like. I think in this context, this transition from, what was like a hardship maybe, or what was really heavily stigmatized, or what was shameful, whatever that may have been specifically for you, to then come out on the other end of that, and not just not be a source of shame, but be a source of pride. I mean, it's quite cliche at this point, but what did that journey look like for you?
I mean, for me, for sex work in particular, I didn't even know that I was a sex worker sometimes. Like sometimes, I might, trade this or that, like for a place to stay, or, like at one time, I remember this was at one time I rationalized it as tuition help, like as if money is something different because I'm using it like for tuition versus, to go out to a bar. But, that's just the way my mind worked. And so, and I think, and sex work to me is really tied to my queerness. And I think I got comfortable with, with the two different things, at very different times in my life. But they're certainly tied. For me, I think the thing that made me more comfortable with it, to be where I am now, where I, the first time I came out like publicly as a former sex worker, I like whispered it, and now I'm just like, move, I'm a sex worker. But the thing that, like really, I guess, like made me like just refigure, restructure my thinking around everything, was just like having a sense of duty and a sense of community. In a lot of ways, just thinking about former sex workers, whether that be Maya Angelou, whether that be, Marsha P. Johnson, whether, that be, folks around the time of the French Revolution, and just thinking, like being part of this larger community of people that, utilize sex and weaponize sex, to really like see their full humanity. And then also like not just seeing myself as, part of that community, but as a member of that community that therefore has a duty to other people in the community, as with organizing and everything, particularly with the way that sex work is criminalized in New York. That's something that, made my past as a sex worker as something that, I wasn't particularly proud of, that I would, whenever I got into a new relationship, I just would try to like breeze through that part of like, oh, hey, I did these jobs, including being a sex worker, and like moving on to being something that, like I'm, it's, I guess, I don't know if pride's the right word, but just thinking of it as just another job that, that I did, but certainly proud to be in community with so many of the people that I'm organizing with. As far as like a negative experience, I mean, I have had them. I've certainly had them with police officers. I don't have a criminal record from sex work, and that's because of things that I did that I would rather not talk about at the moment. But really, I think the thing that like changed my thinking about it wasn't necessarily the experiences, but it was, really the organizing, and feeling part of the community, and like seeing, newer generations of sex workers today that are really finding their voice and are going up to Albany and are fighting and are demanding, not asking, but demanding their right to be seen and, their right to a space at the table.
Yeah. And I want to bring you in, Blake, but just one point that you highlighted, I wanted to again just kind of think about scaling out as well, is you had mentioned in the context of school tuition, and again, this just illustrates how this goes even far beyond our own experiences, because we're talking about school debt that's reached $1.5 trillion. This massive bubble, which again, COVID and Zoom education may finally burst. But Eric Weinstein has suggested, pretty controversially, that in fact, there's this whole generation. If you look at, for instance, the final debate stage, there's a whole generation of what he calls a kleptocratic gerontocracy, of a generation of people that has essentially exploited through these false stories and narratives, such as education is the great equalizer. If you have a college degree, you will have a secure path to the American dream and a house and a white picket fence, and all shall be okay. These are false narratives that have been peddled now for decades, and they're so embedded in the American DNA and ethos that we still shell out hundreds of thousands of dollars for degrees after which, if you look at the data, almost half of all college graduates are underemployed. So they're working in a job that doesn't require that college degree. And again, there's so many layers here of subversion and of artifice and of performance in lies. But the way Eric frames it is actually there's a generation of people who represented in the highest halls of leadership, both of universities and law schools and our federal government and the like, that to Jared's point, to your personal experience, they know you have to foot that $300,000 bill to get that law degree and to get certified in order to do anything and to affect any change in the law. Whether or not that degree actually carries substantive value is a different question, but you have to take on that debt. And then you feel, because we have a system that fundamentally blames the individual, right? Rugged individualism for us, then that, in effect, coercion, which is structural and institutional, ends up contributing to, again, a generation, an era where suicides and self-harm and overdoses have become these leading causes of death. It's so pernicious, it's so perverse, it's so provocative. But again, your personal story in so many ways is just illustrates that. And this is true on a national level.
I think I'm muted. Yeah, I mean, just talking about college debt, my members, I know the cost of law school since 2007 for private law schools has gone up about 34%. For public has gone up about 43%. A majority of my members have over 150 that have law school debt, which is almost 70% of them. A majority of them have over $150,000 of debt. And that's to take on a job where, we love what we do. But it's just underpaid and like the classical overworked and underpaid job, being a public defender, immigration attorney in New York. So yeah, it's really unfortunate that education it's this barrier that you're told you have to climb over in order to really affect changes in the communities that need them the most. But as someone who taught in a law school before, I don't want to say law school is bullshit, but I don't necessarily know that I needed to, take 3 years of time and amass all that debt just to be able to write pretty sentences and know a little bit about areas of law that I will never practice. That's a whole other topic.
Particularly in an age, by the way, and it's not just you. Barack Obama came out and said illegal education should be cut down to 2 years. But this is particularly true in an age, again, of automation and artificial intelligence, where, having taught at a law school myself too, and worked in the law, I would say most of the work I did could have been automated. A lot of the legal research work, a lot of the entry-level legal work, but these are self-regulating bodies, right? Where the industry decides its own rules. But to the kind of meta theme of everything being drag or some form of performance, right? These rules have such an air of self-righteousness and justice and equality under the law that these are some of the most powerful institutions and gatekeepers.
I also taught at a law school, and I would like to offer my opinion on that.
Go.
It's interesting hearing all of this and feeling like going off of whatever the question was like 3 questions ago. But also, are y'all on the west side? Because it's completely dark by me right now, and I feel like you still have some light.
Yeah, west side.
Anyway, I'm like in the seaport, which I love. The seaport's only drag queen that I know of. But the idea that like, because you can do something as the normalizing effect of even the way we talk about drag being mainstream now, and how being a drag queen can be your job and you can do what you love for a living. Like the language we have around like, oh, because that can be your job and because you can make money doing that, it's something that's seen as normal now. Like that's good. That's a good thing. That's something that people can accept. If you're getting a paycheck, that must mean it's somewhat worthwhile, right? Like it's worth doing. It's legitimate in some way because you're getting paid. And drag is so mainstream now. And if any little boy or girl or anyone in between can dream of getting paid to do drag, like that's how it's being framed, as if it wasn't legitimate when you weren't getting a 1099 for it.
Yeah, I think the idea of human value not being the same as economic value is something that drives me every single day. And the whole idea of just as we've fought as a movement, for years to decouple or try to decouple healthcare from employment, the idea of basic income and basic needs being met, decoupling that from employment, to say that your human worth, your ability to survive, should not be tied or conditional upon the love, approval, validation of anyone. I'm super conscious of the time, but I want to try to fit.
No one has anywhere to go. No one's doing anything. It's fine.
But I want to try to bring in 2 more quick topics and see which ones y'all bite on. One is, we had Jeannie Sue Gerson on a number of weeks ago, and she wrote this. I'm not sure if you saw this, Jared, but she wrote this law review piece called "Sex Lex Machina: On the Rise of the Sex Robot." And we never got to it then, but I'm so curious to hear maybe even both of your takes on. There's different now actually robot ethicists that argue about this new bleeding edge of sex robots. And so some argue, for example, that sex with a robot replicates the unequal power that characterizes prostitution. And the question is, well, if the robots are servile, does this evoke the same concerns we have around exploitation and coercion in humans? Or does it provide, if we think about Westworld as an example, a safe haven, a safe outlet, like, let's say, video games might? So yeah, I'll just throw out there, sex robots.
Honestly, a topic that I hadn't really thought too much about.
I mean, I'd try it. I don't know if I buy one. I try it if there's like a free trial situation.
Free trial.
Yeah. Although then you have to send it back. Like, has it been used before? I don't know. I don't want robot drag. I mean, we have enough robot drag queens that are people, so I don't think we need actual robot drag queens.
So I think one more maybe tangible, kind of close to home example.
I know. I'm like, there's so many things to worry about. Like,
well, so think about the rise and importance of AI voice assistants, right? Mm-hmm. So like Siri or Asana or Google Voice. And again, working in a call center, for example, working in customer service is one of the most common jobs. Millions of people keep a roof over their heads for their families by doing this. And there was a 2019 report that found they're overwhelmingly female-sounding voices. And so there's a feminist writer who wrote about this, Judith Shulevitz, who said, "More than once, I found myself telling my Google Assistant about the sense of emptiness I feel. I'm lonely, I say, which I usually would not confess to anyone but my therapist, not even my husband, who might take it the wrong way." And so we don't even have to think about sex robots, but the reality of our calendars and email and personal assistants having all this data and apps and Facebook and social media and
right.
apps.
It's like when we have sex robots, does Facebook then know like all of that? Like they have all of that data now too.
I'm like so in my thoughts. Repeat your question. Sorry.
Well, I mean, you're framing it in terms of what does the world look like if that's a replacement for sex workers? Like what, like.
So the broader context,
yeah.
So the broader context, and we'll just finish off on this, is that to every single point of what we talked about, right, in the context of the criminalization of homosexuality, even to begin with, and gender variance, and sex work, and drag, and all of the above, there's no natural order to things. There's also no natural order to things like technology, but we've assumed that there is because it's just seeped into our lives. But actually, just in the same way that, as we talked about before, systems are working as designed based on choices that are being made. The choices being made about the regulation of our data are made by design, and they're choices that are made. So if you take a recent example where Grindr was sold to a Chinese company that has that the Chinese government has an ownership stake in, and they recently had to sell it back to their American owners because the federal government said this was a national security threat. But we now operate, especially under times of COVID, entirely in the realm of data and digital communication. And these are for-profit firms that write the regulations for themselves and control and resell and sell our data. And again, I know this sounds kind of abstract, but very concretely, in the 2016 election, we all heard about the Cambridge Analytica scandal, right? And what this is Facebook engaged in the selling and reselling of targeted voter data. And this can sway the outcome of national elections. And what the version of that is today is Clearview AI, so facial recognition technology that we use to unlock our phones every day. Again, it's just how it is. It's just the architecture of the world in which we live, right? It's just how it is. But again, nothing is just the way it is. These are deliberate policy choices and lobbying efforts, because Clearview AI now has the biggest database in the world of facial recognition software, which, if you think about, again, the disproportionate effects on Black and brown people, particularly when it's used in policing and in public housing and in public health decisions. Again, there's so much to get to, but it just illustrates the importance in this age of having a government, having our leaders understand the role that data and data rights have. That there's no natural order to how technology is used or abused.
And we have versions of sex robots now. Like, we're kind of doing that already. Like, whatever it is.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Like, most of us are having whatever version of sex we're having virtually or remote or whatever, like digitally now. Or we're going to Hell's Kitchen and partying, but that's a whole other Zoom session.
So in the interest, So in the interest of time, I'll let you comment, Jared, and I'll let the both of you wrap up, reflect, share any parting thoughts, plug any thing you'd like to, and I'll let you go. So go ahead, Jared.
Yeah, just to answer your question from before, I mean, I just think that as a society, we are really bad at, if we are going to determine that people's worth or the worth of people's labor should be, we should use dollars to measure that. I just feel like we've always been really bad at that. And I don't see why the sale of, your personal data would be any different. Thinking as a former sex worker, like how, I think that we're really bad at determining how we want to monetize sex services. Blake, if you give a show that slays on a Monday versus a Thursday, you're probably going to make a different amount of tips on those different days. It doesn't, mean that the value of your labor is any different. It's just that I think that as a society, we're really bad at really determining, like what is a fair monetary value to put on something. And so it's something that I do think about quite a bit, when it comes to the sale of data and, what is that worth? I mean, right now we're selling it for free. You can, in order to play, I actually don't play Animal Farm. I'm like the only gay that doesn't, but like
I've never played in my life.
Okay, the only two gays that don't.
But my mom does every single Facebook game. I'm like, Cambridge Analytica is operating just solely for my mom's like Facebook users and like every single one. I think she's watching now too. But anyway.
Exactly. But it's just, I mean, like, I do it. I mean, like, I don't do Animal Farm, but like, I'll sign up for whatever thing to get a 5% coupon off. And it's just like, is my personal data worth 5% off at the Gap? Probably not, but I'm doing it anyway. And I think that a lot of people are in that same boat. And I, really, I think it's something, it's what attracts me to your campaign, is that you are having these discussions about, what is data worth? What is, almost the essence of someone? Like, what is that worth? And why are we not, with so much poverty in the world and with just so much economic uncertainty that a lot of people are experiencing, why are we not putting some value on that?
Right. And here's the thing also, is I know for us and just the way we interact with our phones and the world, all these concerns seem like hypothetical or theoretical, but they're not. If you look at Hong Kong and how the Chinese government has used facial recognition technology to not just police and quash dissidents, but to abuse.
That's why I shouldn't use AirPods. No. You probably have to go into like mic settings and switch it to your MacBook instead of the mic.
Yeah. Yes. And so literally more than 1 million Uyghurs in China, which are Muslim ethnic minorities, they have used facial recognition. Again, the thing that we're just like, it's just how we open our phone now. First, we're like, we got to use our fingerprints. So now they have a database of everyone's fingerprints, which are then outsourced to police departments and the FBI. And then now we just got to use our face. And again, me too, right? This is just how the seeming natural order of events is. But the use of this, and especially as it relates to the LGBT community, there are countries now that round people up on the basis of this data and the sale of this data. And so this really is a matter of life or death in countries where homosexuality is not just criminalized, but subject to capital punishment, to death, to stoning, to hanging. So there are real world consequences to the sale and the resale and the abuse of data, especially as it relates to queer people. So I want to thank the both of you so much, so much for joining this really far-reaching dialectic. I so appreciate it. I so appreciate your voices and your activism and your leadership in these times, because again, every single person, we all have these choices we make about what we stand up for, the truth we tell, yeah, I just thank you both so much. Now you should like, subscribe, and comment, because on Sunday we will have Muhan Zhang on at 4 p.m. Eastern, and many more exciting, amazing people like Jared and Blake. And follow them on Twitter and Instagram and the like. So thank you both so much. If you have anything else you want to share or conclude on, feel free to.
We have a presidential primary now, so that's exciting.
Well, so the primary has been restored. You can vote by mail.
Yeah.
If you go to nycabsentee.com/absentee, it takes literally 1 minute. It took me 1 minute to request your mail-in ballot. Everyone can do it. And yes, we do now have a presidential primary. They are challenging it. They are appealing it to the Second Circuit. So TBD. But yes, everyone can and should vote safely by mail from home.
Wouldn't it be crazy if we just did that anyway? Just mailed everyone a ballot? Wouldn't that be wild?
It would be. It's like we can actually do it if we choose to.
It's crazy.
The only thing I guess I'd want to plug is in addition to the presidential primary, there are so many races right now that people should be voting in the primary anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, we live in a quote unquote liberal state, but it does not feel that way right now. During a global pandemic, our governor just cut Medicaid, cut funding to hospitals, increased incarceration for a whole bunch of people in the middle of the night, and no one really cares. People are talking. I mean, I was just hit up on Grindr by someone who called himself a homosexual, and it's I've literally spent that's crying because this governor won't let people out that are on parole, but smoke a joint or whatever, and they have parole violations. So there are so many races that are really we're fighting for the soul of New York, and there's so many organizers. I mean, I think that lawyers are the worst organizers, and you should never if it's only lawyers. But there are just so many just directly impacted folks that are just trying to change so much with rent, with the criminal legal system, with how foster care operates, with how employment operates, and then also remembering that not only Trump but also our governor explicitly excluded undocumented people from any type of relief during COVID. So there's just people need to vote and also tell their assembly member and their senator that they need to go back to session so that the governor has a check, so that we can get a lot of the really great state level legislation passed. Obviously, this is for a congressional race, and the federal work matters, but the federal work can only go so far. You really need both systems working for the betterment of all people.
And we saw that. We saw it 2 years ago, flipping the state. We flipped the state senate 2 years. That's crazy. People just assume we're in New York City, and it matters.
Totally. Love y'all. So appreciate you. Take care. Stay safe. And let's keep at it.